It was late August when I made the decision to move into a modest apartment in the heart of a bustling neighborhood in Chicago. As a sophomore in college, I was excited to start this new chapter in my life. The apartment, with its hardwood floors and quaint charm, was a perfect fit for a student like me. Sure, there were minor inconveniences, like a somewhat creaky elevator and the occasional flickering light in the hallway, but overall, I felt comfortable. I was looking forward to evenings spent studying with a cup of coffee and weekends filled with new experiences. Everything was going smoothly until one night, a noise shattered the calm. I had just settled into bed, exhausted from a long day of classes and work. It was close to midnight when I was jolted awake by a persistent, droning sound, like a power tool being operated in the apartment next door. I rubbed my eyes, glancing at the clock, 12:03 a.m. My first thought was that the apartment next to mine, which was supposed to be vacant, must have finally found a tenant. I dismissed it as a minor annoyance, hoping they would finish quickly. But the noise continued, drilling, followed by a loud bass thumping through the walls, like a distant party. I sat up, heart racing. Curiosity mixed with irritation pushed me out of bed. I tiptoed to the thin walls, pressing my ear against the cool surface, trying to decipher the commotion. Feeling uneasy, I decided to investigate. I slipped on my oversized hoodie, tossed my messy hair into a bun, and crept out of my apartment. The hallway was dimly lit, shadows dancing along the walls as I approached the door of the neighboring unit. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. What if I interrupted someone's late-night project? What if I was intruding? Gathering my courage, I knocked lightly. The sound of my knuckles tapping against the door felt ominously loud in the stillness of the night. Silence followed, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Was anyone even there? Just as I was about to turn back, I heard shuffling inside, and the door creaked open. 4 men stood before me, their faces partially obscured in the dim light spilling out from the apartment. They were clad in dark clothes, their expressions unreadable. An uneasy feeling settled in my stomach as I scanned the room beyond them. It was cluttered with boxes, tools, and an unsettling assortment of objects I couldn't quite make out. I felt the hairs on my arms stand on end. "Can I help you?" one of them asked, a hint of annoyance lacing his voice. He stepped forward, blocking the view of the others behind him. There was something in his eyes, a coldness that made me instinctively take a step back. I heard some noise and thought you might need help or something," I stammered, forcing a nervous smile. My heart raced as I fought the urge to run back to the safety of my apartment. "We're fine," he replied curtly. "Just finishing up some work." The way he said it felt dismissive, as if he were trying to brush me off, and I could sense the tension thickening in the air. Before I could ask anything else, the door was nearly shut in my face. I barely managed to catch a glimpse of their surroundings. Shadows flitted about as they moved back to their tasks, their voices hushed, but the menacing atmosphere lingered long after the door closed. I returned to my apartment, my mind racing. What were they doing at this hour? Why had they chosen to move in now, in the dead of night? A sense of dread washed over me, and I felt an unsettling knot tighten in my stomach. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that they were just late-night workers, perhaps doing some renovations or repairs. Yet, the more I thought about it, the more questions surfaced. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Each night, I lay in bed, listening intently for any sign of movement from the neighboring unit. The sounds of drilling and loud music became a regular occurrence. Despite my attempts to ignore it, the noises gnawed at my subconscious, feeding my anxiety. It wasn't just the noises that troubled me, it was the men themselves. Their demeanor felt off, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were hiding something. I often spotted them in the hallway, their conversations hushed, their laughter chilling. There was an unsettling camaraderie between them, one that made me feel like an outsider, a mere observer of something I shouldn't have seen. The most unnerving aspect was the way they seemed to know when I was around. If I stepped out of my apartment, they would suddenly fall silent, their eyes flickering toward me. I couldn't help but feel as if I was being watched, like a prey caught in a predator's gaze. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to step out for some fresh air. I descended the stairs, careful to avoid the creaking steps, and slipped outside. The cool night air felt refreshing against my skin, but as I strolled down the street, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I turned around several times, but the street was empty, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I tried to shake off the paranoia, but it clung to me like a second skin. As I made my way back to the apartment building, I noticed something strange. The front door of the neighboring unit was ajar. A shiver ran down my spine as I hesitated outside. Should I go in? Should I call someone? My curiosity battled against my fear. In the end, curiosity won, and I pushed the door open slightly, peering inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. The apartment was eerily quiet, the lights off. But on the floor lay various tools scattered about, and a series of strange symbols drawn in chalk covered the walls. The atmosphere felt thick, almost suffocating. My heart raced as I stepped inside, drawn by an invisible force. That was when I heard it, a low murmur of voices coming from the back of the apartment. I froze, fear gripping me like a vice. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist in the dim light as I slowly backed away, my instincts screaming at me to leave. Just then, a loud bang erupted from the back room, making me jump. Without thinking, I dashed out of the apartment, slamming the door behind me. Breathless and terrified, I stumbled back to my own apartment. I locked the door and collapsed against it, my mind racing with what I had just seen. Who were those men? What were they doing? I could no longer convince myself that it was just some harmless late-night project. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface now erupted into full-blown terror. Days turned into nights, and the oppressive feeling of dread refused to lift. My life became a series of anxious moments, each one stretching my nerves thinner. I couldn't focus on my studies. Every time I sat down to read, the memories of that night replayed in my mind like a warped film reel. The strange noises, the men's unsettling behavior, and the odd symbols on the walls haunted me relentlessly. I began to avoid my apartment, spending more time at the library and at cafes, anything to keep my mind off the apartment next door. I confided in a few classmates about my experiences, but they laughed it off, chalking it up to overactive imagination. After all, who would believe a simple college student over a group of mysterious men? But I couldn't let it go. My instincts told me there was something deeply wrong happening in that apartment. It was as if a dark cloud loomed over my home, casting shadows on everything I once enjoyed. I decided I needed to confront my fears and find out the truth. One stormy evening, I resolved to investigate once again. The rain poured down in heavy sheets, and the wind howled outside, making it the perfect cover for my covert operation. I waited until I could hear the faint sound of music drifting through the walls, then slipped out of my apartment. As I approached the door to the neighboring unit, I noticed it was slightly ajar again. My heart raced as I peered inside, gathering the courage to step in. The music was louder now, a throbbing bass that resonated in my chest. Shadows flickered across the walls, creating an atmosphere that felt almost alive. I took a deep breath, stepping over the threshold. The dim light illuminated the chaos within. Empty bottles littered the floor, and the symbols I had seen before were now joined by more complex drawings, glowing faintly. In the center of the room, the four men stood, their backs to me, engaged in a heated discussion. "What the hell are we going to do if she finds out?" one of them exclaimed, his voice sharp and urgent. "She won't say anything if she knows what's good for her," another man replied coldly. "We need to keep this under wraps. We can't have anyone snooping around." My heart dropped. They were talking about me. Panic surged through me as I realized the gravity of my situation. I wanted to turn back to run, but something rooted me in place. The last man spoke, and his words sent chills down my spine. "Tonight's the night. We have to finish before dawn, or it will all be for nothing." I felt the weight of their secrecy crashing down on me. What were they planning? My mind raced with possibilities, each one more sinister than the last. I needed to find out more. Quietly, I moved further into the apartment, careful to avoid any creaking floorboards. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the back room, followed by silence. The men whipped around, their expressions shifting from irritation to alarm. My heart raced as I ducked behind a large pile of boxes, praying they wouldn't find me. "What was that?" one of them whispered, peering cautiously towards the source of the noise. The air felt electric with tension, and I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears. Just then, the door to the back room swung open, and a figure emerged, a woman, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with fear. I didn't recognize her, but something about her presence made my skin crawl. "They're coming for me," she gasped, her voice trembling. "You have to let me go. I can't stay here." The men exchanged worried glances, but instead of reassuring her, they moved closer, their intentions clearly threatening. I had to do something. Instinctively, I grabbed my phone, my fingers shaking as I prepared to call for help. But just as I hit the emergency button, the woman turned to me, her eyes locking onto mine. "Please! You have to help me!" she cried, desperation etched on her face. It was then that I noticed the faint outline of symbols drawn on her wrists, mirroring those on the walls. A shiver ran down my spine as realization struck me. They were involved in something dark and twisted, something that reached far beyond my understanding. Before I could react, one of the men lunged towards her, and without thinking, I shouted, "Get away from her!" My voice echoed through the apartment, and in that split second, the atmosphere shifted from clandestine to chaotic. The men turned towards me, surprise morphing into fury as they lunged forward. I bolted, sprinting towards the exit, adrenaline pumping through my veins. The woman's terrified scream echoed behind me as I dashed out of the apartment, slamming the door shut just in time. "Call the cops!" I shouted to no one in particular as I sprinted down the hallway, my heart racing with fear. I could hear their footsteps pounding behind me, and I pushed myself to run faster, adrenaline fueling my flight. I rushed down the stairs and burst through the front door into the pouring rain. The cold droplets felt refreshing against my skin, but I didn't stop to breathe. I ran towards the nearest street corner, desperately looking for help. My mind raced with thoughts of the woman and what those men were capable of. Finally, I spotted a police car parked at the curb, its lights flashing. I sprinted towards it, waving my arms frantically. The officer stepped out, eyes widening in concern as he took in my disheveled appearance. "What happened?" he asked, urgency in his voice. "There are men in my apartment building. They're doing something illegal," I gasped, trying to catch my breath. "They have a woman trapped. You have to help her." The officer's expression turned serious as he motioned for me to calm down. "Stay here. I'll check it out." He returned to the car, calling for backup. My heart raced as I watched him head toward the building, fear clawing at my insides. I felt like a ticking time bomb, terrified of what might happen next. Moments later, several squad cars arrived, blue lights flashing against the rain-soaked pavement. With a surge of hope, I led the officers back to the apartment, my heart pounding as we approached the door. Just as we reached it, the door swung open, and the men spilled out, surprise etched on their faces. The officer shouted for them to freeze, and they hesitated, momentarily stunned. "Get on the ground!" he ordered, drawing his weapon. The men's expressions shifted from confusion to anger, but before they could react, backup arrived, and the situation quickly escalated. I watched in disbelief as the officers apprehended the men, the woman emerging from the apartment, her face pale but relieved. "Thank you," she whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. As the chaos unfolded around me, I felt a sense of closure wash over me. I had faced my fears, confronted the darkness that had threatened my life, and emerged stronger. In the aftermath, it was revealed that the men were involved in an underground operation, using the apartment as a base for their illicit activities. The woman had been a victim, caught in their web of deceit. The experience left me shaken, but I was grateful for the outcome. As I settled back into my own apartment, the echoes of that terrifying night lingered, but I refused to let fear dictate my life. I would move forward, embracing each new day with a newfound strength, knowing that I had the courage to confront the unknown, no matter how terrifying it might be. It was a crisp autumn morning when I first noticed the moving truck pull into the driveway of the dilapidated old house next door. My family and I had lived in our charming little abode for 4 years, relishing the peace and tranquility that enveloped our neighborhood. We were used to the rhythmic sound of children playing, the laughter echoing through the air, and the occasional bark of our neighbor's dog. But everything changed that day. The new neighbor, a man named Steve, stepped out of the truck, looking rather unkempt. His hair was disheveled, and his clothes seemed a size too big for him, hanging loosely from his frame. He carried an air of solitude that was palpable, as if he had wrapped himself in a cloak of isolation. My wife, Elena, and I exchanged glances, a silent understanding passing between us. We both felt a strange unease creeping into our thoughts, yet we tried to push it aside, attributing it to the natural hesitance of welcoming someone new into the fold. In the days that followed, Steve settled into his new home. At first, it was simple things, the occasional glimpse of him through the window as he unpacked boxes or mowed his lawn. But something was off. He rarely acknowledged our presence, even when we waved from our yard. It was as if he existed in a different realm, a separate world from ours. The children were thrilled, of course. Our 3 kids, Lucy, Ethan, and little Mia, had always enjoyed playing outside, and with the arrival of a new neighbor, they hoped for a potential playmate. But every time they ventured too close to Steve's property, he would peer out from his window, a curious glint in his eyes that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't just a glance. It felt like he was studying them, taking mental notes of their every move. I brushed off my concerns, thinking perhaps he was just shy. As the weeks went by, things took a turn for the bizarre. One evening, while I was grilling in the backyard, I noticed a peculiar flickering light coming from Steve's upstairs window. I thought it was just my imagination at first, a trick of the fading light. But then Lucy came running up to me, her face pale. "Dad, there's a weird light coming from Mr. Steve's house," she exclaimed, pointing in the direction of his window. "What do you mean, sweetie?" I asked, half laughing, thinking she might just be scared of the dark. "I swear, Dad, it's flashing like a strobe light," she insisted. I tried to dismiss her fears, but as I turned to look, I did see a faint glow pulsing intermittently. A knot formed in my stomach. Steve's house had always seemed dark and lifeless, yet here was this strange light, inviting yet unnerving. That night, the kids were restless. I tucked them into bed, reassuring them that everything was fine. But just as I was about to settle down with Elena, we heard a noise, a creaking sound followed by a soft thud. My heart raced. I looked at Elena, who was already glancing towards the back door, her expression mirroring my unease. "I'll check it out," I said, forcing myself to rise from the couch. Armed with nothing but a flashlight, I cautiously approached the back door. As I stepped outside, the cool air hit my face, sending chills down my spine. When I reached the fence separating our yards, I saw Steve standing there, just beyond the shadows. He appeared startled as I stepped into the light. "Oh, didn't see you there," he mumbled, scratching the back of his head. There was an awkward silence, and I felt a wave of discomfort wash over me. It was almost as if he had been waiting for something, or someone. "Just checking things out. Heard some noises," I replied, trying to maintain my composure. He nodded slowly, and for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Was it curiosity, or something darker? I couldn't tell. "Nothing to worry about," he said a bit too quickly. "Just, adjusting to the new place, you know?" I forced a smile, feeling the urge to retreat back to the safety of my home. "Yeah, we all go through that," I replied before turning to head inside. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, his gaze lingering longer than it should have. The following week, the kids were outside playing when they noticed the back gate was slightly ajar. Mia, being the adventurous one, crept toward it, and I immediately felt a surge of panic. I called out, "Mia, come back here!" As I rushed to her, I noticed Steve was standing by the fence, a crooked smile on his face. "Kids can be so curious," he said, his tone strange, almost menacing. "They love to explore, don't they?" I didn't appreciate the way he spoke. My instincts screamed at me to pull my children away from him. I could feel his eyes on me, analyzing every move I made. "Let's head inside, kids," I urged, ushering them back towards the house. It wasn't long after that when I started to notice other odd occurrences. My wife would hear strange sounds in the middle of the night, scratching noises that seemed to come from the walls. At first, we attributed it to the age of our house, but as the sounds grew more persistent, so did our concern. One night, I woke to a loud bang. It echoed through the halls, shaking me from my sleep. I grabbed my phone, checking the time, 2:13 a.m. I glanced at Elena, who was still sound asleep, her chest rising and falling gently. I slipped out of bed and crept towards the source of the noise, which had come from the back door. With each step, the unease grew, coiling tightly in my stomach. Peering out the window, I was greeted by an unsettling sight. Steve's house was dark, but there, standing just behind the fence, was a figure. I squinted, my heart racing. It was him, Steve, motionless in the shadows. "Steve!" I called out, though my voice trembled slightly. He didn't move. The stillness was eerie. I felt a chill run down my spine as I reached for the doorknob, debating whether to confront him or call the police. I hesitated, but just as I was about to step outside, he turned abruptly, disappearing into the darkness. I stood frozen, grappling with confusion and fear. Who was this man? Why was he lurking outside at this hour? I felt an instinctual urge to protect my family at all costs. As the days wore on, I realized that Steve was more than just a strange neighbor. He was a shadow lurking in the corners of my mind, and I was determined to uncover the truth behind his unsettling presence. After that haunting night, I became hyper-aware of Steve and his actions. The more I observed him, the more unsettling his behavior seemed. It was as if he was a character from a thriller novel, one that I couldn't put down but also wished I could escape. Our neighborhood had always been a tight-knit community. Elena and I would often host barbecues and gatherings, fostering friendships with those around us. However, with Steve next door, everything felt different. I found myself avoiding conversations with neighbors, fearing they might think I was paranoid. Yet the incidents piled up, each one amplifying my dread. One particularly eerie evening, I stood washing dishes when I caught sight of Steve through the window. He was in his backyard, but he wasn't doing anything overtly alarming, just standing there staring. His expression was vacant, as though he were lost in thought. I strained to listen for any signs of life from his side of the fence, but there was only silence. "Elena, come here," I called softly, not wanting to startle her. She came in, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "What is it?" she asked, following my gaze toward the window. "Look," I whispered. She leaned closer, her eyes narrowing as she spotted Steve. "He's just standing there, that's creepy," she murmured. I nodded, my heart racing. "It's like he's watching us, waiting for something." Elena frowned. "You should talk to him, maybe see if he's okay. This isn't normal behavior." I knew she was right, but I felt a lump forming in my throat at the thought of approaching him. What if he reacted negatively? What if he was truly unhinged? The paranoia clung to me like a heavy cloak, suffocating my resolve. But the following day, while mowing the lawn, I steeled myself to confront him. I'd waited too long to address the growing tension between us. As I maneuvered the mower near the fence, I saw him step out onto his patio, a cautious smile breaking across his face. "Hey, neighbor!" I called out, forcing the words through clenched teeth. "Hello?" he replied, his tone oddly cheerful. "I thought I'd check in on you. You've been awfully quiet lately," I said, trying to sound casual. He chuckled softly, but the sound felt hollow. "Just keeping to myself, you know how it is." "Yeah, I get that. But it's good to socialize now and then, especially in a neighborhood like this." I continued probing further. "Socializing isn't for everyone," he replied, his smile fading. Sometimes it's better to observe from the sidelines. I felt a chill creep down my spine at his words. I couldn't help but wonder what he meant by that. I forced a smile, eager to change the subject. Well, if you ever want to join us for a barbecue, we'd love to have you over. He merely nodded, his gaze drifting away as if he were already somewhere else. The conversation fizzled, leaving a heavy silence hanging between us. I returned to mowing the lawn, heart pounding, convinced that I had barely scratched the surface of something deeply unsettling. That evening, Elena and I were watching a movie when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A flicker of light from Steve's window again. It wasn't just a light. It was pulsing rhythmically, much like the one Lucy had described weeks earlier. I felt a sense of urgency rising within me, a compulsion to uncover the truth behind Steve's strange behavior. Do you think we should investigate? I asked, glancing over at Elena. I don't know, Ben. It feels risky, she replied, biting her lip nervously. We can't just let it go on like this. We need to know what's happening over there, I insisted. Against her better judgment, Elena agreed to accompany me. We slipped on our jackets and made our way outside, the chill of the evening air biting at our skin. As we approached the fence, I could see the light more clearly. It was coming from the upstairs window and flickering erratically. Should we knock? Elena whispered, her voice barely above a breath. I shook my head. Let's just observe for a moment. I want to understand what he's doing. We crouched low behind the fence, our breath coming out in clouds of mist as we waited. Suddenly, the light went out, plunging the house into darkness. A sense of dread settled over us. What if he saw us? Elena whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Before I could answer, I heard a creaking noise from the house, followed by footsteps on the wooden floorboards. My heart raced as I strained to listen, hoping for any sign of what was happening inside. Then, without warning, a loud crash erupted, followed by a muffled sound. My instincts kicked in. We need to go. Now! I whispered urgently, grabbing Elena's arm as we hurried back to our house, hearts pounding in our chests. Once inside, we locked the door and slumped against the wall, adrenaline coursing through us. Did you hear that? Elena asked, her voice trembling. Yeah, I did, I admitted, my mind racing. Something's not right with him. We need to tell the kids to stay away from his yard. The next morning, I called my friend, Detective Thompson, who lived a few blocks away. I explained the situation, the strange noises, the flickering lights, and the odd behavior of Steve. He listened patiently, and after a brief pause, he assured me he'd look into it. A couple of days passed, and I found it increasingly difficult to shake off the feeling of dread. Steve had become a dark shadow in our lives, casting a pall over our home. I couldn't help but wonder what secrets he was hiding behind those closed doors. The turning point came one evening when I received a call from Detective Thompson. Ben, I need you to sit down, he said, his tone grave. Is everything okay? I asked, my heart dropping. Not really. We've had some reports about Steve. He has a history of, let's just say he's had some run-ins with the law. I suggest you keep your family close and stay vigilant. Panic washed over me. What do you mean? What has he done? There have been accusations of stalking and some disturbing behavior. I can't disclose too much, but I need you to be careful. Don't confront him alone, he warned before ending the call. The world around me felt like it was closing in. My suspicions were validated, but I didn't feel relieved. I felt more afraid than ever. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as a storm raged outside. The wind howled, and rain lashed against the windows, creating a cacophony of noise that only amplified my anxiety. Suddenly, I heard it, a soft tapping sound echoing through the house, persistent and eerie. I shot up in bed, heart racing, straining to identify the source. Elena? I whispered, but she was already awake, her eyes wide with fear. Do you hear that? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, it's coming from the back door, I said, swinging my legs over the side of the bed. As I crept towards the door, the tapping grew louder, more urgent. My mind raced with images of Steve lurking just outside, waiting for the right moment to strike. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins, heightening my senses. "Stay here," I instructed Elena firmly as I grabbed a heavy flashlight and opened the door. The darkness loomed around me like a thick fog, the sound of the rain masking any other noises. I stepped outside, the cold air hitting my face like a slap. The tapping had ceased, and the yard was eerily silent. I scanned the area, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the wet grass. Then, suddenly, I saw him, Steve, standing at the edge of the fence, his silhouette barely visible against the backdrop of the storm. "What do you want?" I called out, my voice trembling with anger and fear. He didn't respond, just stood there, his face obscured by the shadows. A sense of dread washed over me, and I stepped back instinctively, ready to retreat. "Steve, this isn't funny. Go back inside," I yelled, my heart pounding in my chest. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and unsettling. "You're watching me. I see you." My stomach twisted at his words. I felt exposed, vulnerable in that moment. "Get away from my house!" I shouted, fear giving way to rage. He chuckled softly, a sound devoid of warmth. "You can't hide from what you can't see." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I stood frozen, grappling with the reality of the situation. I rushed back inside, locking the door behind me, my heart still racing. The following days were a blur of anxiety and fear. The atmosphere in our home had shifted, and the children picked up on it. I could see the worry etched on Elena's face every time I glanced her way. We spoke in hushed tones, trying to shield the kids from the storm brewing outside our lives. Lucy, our oldest, began asking questions. "Why don't we ever go outside anymore, Dad?" she pressed one afternoon, her brow furrowed in concern. "It's just a little cold out, sweetheart. We'll play outside again soon," I replied, forcing a smile despite the heaviness weighing on my heart. That evening, as I tucked them into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. I sat in the hallway, listening to the rain patter against the windows, lost in thought. It was then that I realized I couldn't live in fear any longer. We needed to confront Steve, to confront the darkness that had seeped into our lives. I decided to reach out to Detective Thompson again. "I can't live like this. We need to do something. I'm worried about my family," I pleaded. "I understand, Ben. I'll come over and we can talk about a plan," he replied, and we set a time for him to visit. Later that night, as the rain continued to pour, I heard a commotion outside. My heart raced as I crept towards the window, peering through the rain-streaked glass. To my horror, I saw Steve in his backyard, pacing back and forth, his hands running through his hair in agitation. "Ben, what's going on?" Elena's voice cut through my panic. "Steve's outside again. I think something's wrong," I replied, anxiety bubbling up inside me. "Should we call the police?" she asked, but before I could respond, there was a loud knock at the front door. Startled, I turned to Elena. "Did you invite anyone over?" No one's supposed to be here," she replied, her voice trembling. I grabbed my phone, ready to dial 911, but before I could, I heard Steve's voice, muffled through the door. "Ben! I need to talk to you." My blood ran cold. "What does he want?" "I'm not sure, but I don't think we should open the door," Elena urged, panic creeping into her voice. "We can't ignore him," I said, my resolve hardening. I took a deep breath and approached the door, my heart pounding in my chest. "Steve, what do you want?" I called out, opening the door just a crack. His eyes glinted with an unsettling intensity. "I know you've been watching me. You're not the only one with secrets, you know. What are you talking about?" I demanded, feeling the anger swell within me. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You don't know who I am or what I'm capable of." My stomach twisted at his words. "Get off my property, Steve. Leave us alone." He chuckled, a chilling sound that sent shivers down my spine. "You think you can just walk away from this?" You're already in too deep. I slammed the door shut, locking it with shaking hands. Call the police! I yelled at Elena, my heart racing. She rushed to the phone, and as I stepped back, I glanced out the window, only to find him staring back at me through the glass, his expression unreadable. The police arrived within minutes, lights flashing, casting eerie shadows in the darkness. Detective Thompson stepped out of the car, surveying the scene. What's going on, Ben? I quickly recounted everything, the strange lights, the noises, the encounters with Steve. As I spoke, I could see the concern etched on Thompson's face. We'll take it from here, he assured me, his voice calm but firm. As they approached Steve's house, I felt a mixture of relief and fear. This could finally be over. I watched as they knocked on the door, and after a tense moment, Steve answered, his demeanor unsettlingly calm. Mr. Steve, we need to ask you some questions, Thompson said, his voice authoritative. But Steve merely smiled, an unnerving grin spreading across his face. Questions? I have questions too, he replied cryptically, before stepping back, closing the door behind him. Stay here, Thompson ordered, motioning for his partner to follow him as they moved cautiously toward the house. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as we waited, hearts pounding with anxiety. Then, suddenly, we heard a commotion, a loud crash followed by shouting. Ben, stay inside! Thompson yelled as they pushed through the back gate. Elena and I huddled together, watching anxiously as the police moved around the property. The tension was palpable, and as we peered through the window, we saw Steve standing in his backyard, facing the officers with a wild look in his eyes. Don't come any closer, he shouted, his voice filled with rage. Steve, put your hands where we can see them, Thompson commanded, his tone steady but laced with urgency. And then it happened. Steve turned and bolted toward the woods at the edge of his property. Stop! Police! The officers yelled, chasing after him into the darkness. I felt a rush of adrenaline, a mix of fear and hope flooding through me. I turned to Elena, and we watched anxiously as the chase unfolded outside. After what felt like an eternity, the officers returned, breathless but determined. He's gone, Thompson said, frustration evident in his voice. But we'll find him. He can't hide forever. As the officers conducted a search of the property, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The worst seemed to be over, but the lingering fear remained. That night, I locked all the doors and windows, determined to keep my family safe. As I lay in bed, I glanced over at Elena, who was fast asleep, the weight of our ordeal heavy on her. Days turned into weeks, and we tried to return to normalcy. The children resumed their routines, and though the fear lingered, we found solace in each other. Then one day, I received a call from Thompson. Ben, we found him, he said, his voice steady. We're bringing Steve in for questioning. He's not a threat anymore. Relief flooded through me. Thank you. Thank you so much, I said, my voice trembling with gratitude. As time went on, Steve's presence faded from our lives. The police investigated thoroughly, and while his past was troubling, he was ultimately released due to lack of evidence. Eventually, our neighborhood regained its peace. The flickering lights from Steve's house became a distant memory, a haunting reminder of the darkness that had threatened to envelop us. We learned to cherish the little moments, to find joy in the laughter of our children and the warmth of our home. Though the scars remained, we emerged stronger, united in our resolve to protect one another from the shadows that had once loomed so close. And as I sat on our porch, watching the sun set over the horizon, I couldn't help but feel grateful for the safety of my family, for the love we shared, and for the lessons learned in the face of fear. Because in the end, it wasn't just about a neighbor. It was about the resilience of the human spirit, the power of love, and the courage to face the unknown, no matter how terrifying it might be. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Clara and I finally pulled up to our new home, a quaint little house on the outskirts of Maplewood, a small town nestled within the embrace of nature. The trees were dressed in vibrant hues of orange and red, and the scent of fallen leaves filled the air, blending with the fresh, earthy smell of the nearby forest. As I stepped out of our old pickup truck, I felt a wave of excitement wash over me. This was our chance to start anew, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. Our new house was charming, with a white picket fence that framed a small front yard, complete with a swing set that creaked softly in the wind. The house was slightly aged, with wooden shutters that had seen better days, but it had character, something I had always longed for in a home. Clara, her eyes sparkling with delight, immediately began envisioning how we would decorate each room. We had talked for months about this moment, and now it felt surreal to finally be here. After unloading our belongings, we decided to explore the neighborhood. The street was quiet, lined with well-kept houses and manicured lawns. As we walked, I noticed an elderly couple living in a house behind ours. They were out in their yard, tending to their garden. The woman, with her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, seemed to glare at us from behind the flowers, while the man, short and stout, watched us with an intensity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I shrugged it off, attributing their behavior to typical neighborly curiosity. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across our yard, Clara and I settled into our new living room. The faint crackling of the fireplace provided a warm ambience, but the cozy atmosphere soon began to feel stifling. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of the elderly couple through their window, their faces illuminated by the glow of their own fireplace. It was unsettling, but I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. That first night, sleep eluded me. Clara had drifted off, her soft breathing a soothing sound in the silence of the house, but my mind was restless. The wind outside howled through the trees, and I lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the day. Suddenly, I heard a faint tapping sound coming from the window next to our bed. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. The tapping continued, a slow, rhythmic beat that seemed to echo my rising anxiety. I slid out of bed, careful not to wake Clara, and tiptoed toward the window. I peered outside, half expecting to see some creature peering in. To my relief, there was nothing but the darkness of the night and the swaying branches of the trees. I let out a shaky breath, reminding myself that I was just being paranoid. But as I turned back toward the bed, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The next morning, I decided to confront my fears. After breakfast, I suggested we introduce ourselves to our neighbors, particularly the elderly couple. Clara agreed, albeit with a hint of hesitation. I figured a friendly gesture might dispel the unease that lingered in my mind. We walked over to their house, the sun shining brightly in the clear blue sky, but the atmosphere felt charged. As we approached, the elderly couple stood in their yard, pruning their roses. The woman looked up first, her eyes narrowing as she took in our presence. The man followed suit, a frown creasing his forehead. "Hello?" I called out, attempting to inject warmth into my voice. "We're your new neighbors, Clara and Jake." The woman's gaze softened slightly, but she didn't respond immediately. The man cleared his throat, the sound gravelly and low. "We don't get many new neighbors around here," he said, his tone oddly curt. "We just moved in yesterday." Clara chimed in, offering a polite smile. "We thought we'd come over and say hi." The woman muttered, her gaze still fixed on us, as if she were assessing our worth. "Well, welcome, I suppose." Before we could continue the conversation, a young man appeared from behind the house. He looked to be in his late 20s, with a scruffy beard and disheveled hair. "Who's this?" he asked, glancing between us and the elderly couple. "I'm Jake, and this is Clara. We just moved in next door," I explained, trying to maintain a friendly demeanor. The young man shrugged. "I don't know much about them," he said, nodding toward the elderly couple. "They keep to themselves mostly." His casual dismissal sent a chill down my spine. I felt like we were standing in the middle of a game where the rules were known only to the players on the other side. The elderly couple's eyes narrowed even further at this young man's words, and a tense silence enveloped us. "Right," I said, trying to shake off the unease. "Well, it was nice meeting you all. If you ever need anything, feel free to stop by." As we walked back to our house, Clara squeezed my hand, her expression a mix of confusion and concern. "That was strange," she said. "Yeah," I replied, glancing back at the elderly couple who were now watching us from the shadows of their garden. "Really strange." That night, I struggled to sleep once more. The tapping returned, echoing through the stillness of the house. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew there was something more. The elderly couple, the young man, and the unsettling events of the past 2 days began to weave a web of anxiety that wrapped tightly around me. As the days turned into weeks, the feeling of unease only grew stronger. Clara and I tried to settle into our routines, but the quietness of our neighborhood felt more oppressive than calming. The elderly couple's house seemed to loom over us, casting long shadows that made our backyard feel like a prison. Each night, I would hear the tapping at the window, accompanied by low whispers that floated through the still air. I often found myself waking in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, heart racing as I listened intently for any signs of movement outside. Clara had begun to notice my restlessness, and while she tried to assure me that everything was fine, I could see the worry etched on her face. One evening, as we were preparing dinner, I decided it was time to confront the couple once more. "Clara, we need to figure out what's going on with our neighbors," I said, my voice tense. "I can't shake the feeling that something isn't right." She nodded slowly, a frown creasing her brow. "What do you want to do?" "Let's invite them over for dinner. Maybe if we get to know them better, we'll understand what's going on." She hesitated, but ultimately agreed. I spent the next few hours preparing a simple meal, hoping that the warmth of food would bridge the gap between us and the couple. Just before dinner, I knocked on their door, my heart pounding in my chest. To my surprise, the woman answered. She looked wary, as though I were a stranger invading her territory. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone sharp. I forced a smile, trying to mask my nerves. "We'd love for you to join us for dinner. Just a casual get-together to get to know each other better." The woman's expression remained unchanged, but after a moment of silence, she glanced back at her husband. He stood behind her, arms crossed, watching me with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. "Fine," she finally said, "but only for a short while." Clara and I set the table, trying to quell our apprehension. When they arrived, the atmosphere felt charged, like a storm about to break. The couple sat stiffly at the table, their eyes darting around as if they were assessing our home for threats. As we ate, I tried to engage them in conversation, but they were evasive, offering only short answers that did little to ease the tension. The woman's gaze seemed to linger on Clara, scrutinizing her as if searching for flaws. The man, meanwhile, focused solely on his plate, occasionally looking up to shoot me a disapproving glance. "Have you lived here long?" Clara asked, attempting to break the ice. The woman scoffed lightly. "Long enough to know that new neighbors don't always fit in." I felt a cold sweat trickle down my spine at her words. "What do you mean by that?" I inquired, forcing myself to remain calm. The man suddenly looked up, his expression grave. "This neighborhood has its secrets. You'd do well to remember that." I exchanged a glance with Clara, her eyes wide with fear. The conversation quickly dwindled, the atmosphere thick with unspoken tension. After what felt like an eternity, the couple excused themselves, leaving us in a haze of confusion and dread. That night, I lay awake, unable to shake the words of our neighbors from my mind. Secrets. What did they mean? I had a feeling it was connected to the tapping at our window, the whispers in the night, and the unsettling feeling of being watched. As the days passed, I became increasingly paranoid. I found myself watching the couple's house more intently, noticing how they rarely left their property. It was almost as if they were waiting for something, or someone. Clara, too, began to feel the strain. The whispers had grown louder, and the tapping turned into frantic scratching that sent chills down my spine. One evening, I decided to take a walk to clear my mind. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the neighborhood. As I strolled past the elderly couple's home, I stopped, compelled to investigate. I felt a magnetic pull toward their yard, and before I knew it, I was standing by their fence, peering through the slats. What I saw sent a shiver through me. The couple stood in their living room, the curtains drawn tightly, but the glow of their television flickered behind them. They were sitting together on their worn-out couch, their expressions blank, staring at the screen with an intensity that felt unnatural. It was as if they were in a trance. Suddenly, I noticed something moving in the shadows of their yard, a figure darting between the trees. My heart raced as I squinted into the darkness, trying to catch a glimpse. But whatever it was had disappeared. I turned to leave, but a rustling noise caught my attention. I turned back to the couple, and to my horror, I realized they were staring directly at me through the window, their eyes wide and unblinking. Panic surged through me as I sprinted back home, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. I burst through the front door, breathless and trembling. Clara looked up from the couch, concern etched on her face. "Jake, what happened?" "They were watching me," I gasped, collapsing onto the couch beside her. "I saw them. They were just sitting there, and they knew I was there." Clara's expression shifted from concern to fear. "We need to leave," she whispered. "This place isn't right." "No," I said, my voice shaking. "We can't just run away. We need to find out what's really going on." But deep down, I knew we were in over our heads. The couple's eyes haunted me, their stares filled with something dark and menacing. I felt trapped in a nightmare that had no end, and I was terrified of what might come next. The days dragged on, each one blending into the next, but the tension in our home was palpable. The tapping continued, the whispers grew louder, and the feeling of being watched became suffocating. Clara and I grew more isolated, retreating into ourselves as we tried to make sense of the chaos surrounding us. One evening, as we were sitting in the dim light of the living room, Clara turned to me, her eyes filled with determination. "I think we need to dig deeper," she said, her voice steady. "If there are secrets here, we have to uncover them." I nodded, knowing she was right. We couldn't let fear dictate our lives any longer. We decided to start by researching the history of our neighborhood. Perhaps understanding its past would shed light on the peculiar behaviors of our neighbors. The next day, we headed to the local library. I delved into old newspapers, searching for any mention of the couple or any unusual occurrences in the area. Clara sifted through property records and local history books, determined to uncover any clues. Hours passed, and just as I was about to give up, I stumbled upon a faded article. The headline read, "Tragedy strikes Maplewood, mysterious disappearances plague neighborhood." My heart raced as I read on. The article detailed several incidents over the years, all involving residents who had mysteriously vanished without a trace. The most chilling part was the mention of the elderly couple. Back when they were younger, they had lived in a different house on the same street, where one of the first disappearances had occurred. "Jake!" Clara exclaimed, leaning over my shoulder. "Look at this!" I turned to see her holding up an old photograph. It depicted a smiling couple, their faces eerily similar to the elderly neighbors we had met. "This is them," Clara said, her voice a mix of excitement and fear. "Wait," I murmured, taking the photograph from her. "What does this mean?" Clara's eyes widened as she read the caption beneath the image. "It says here that they were accused of being involved in the disappearances. But after a police investigation, they were released without charges." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. They got away with it? What if they're still doing something? What if they're responsible for the people who disappeared? "We have to confront them," Clara said, her voice trembling but resolute. "We need to know the truth." That evening, as the sun set behind the trees, casting long shadows across our yard, Clara and I made our way to the elderly couple's house. My heart raced as we knocked on their door, the echoes of our knocks sounding louder than ever in the silence. The woman opened the door, her expression one of annoyance. "What do you want now?" she snapped. "Can we talk?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. We've been hearing things, strange things. We need to know what's going on." She hesitated, glancing back at her husband, who stood behind her, his eyes narrowed. After a tense moment, she sighed and stepped aside. "Fine. Come in." The atmosphere inside their house was heavy, laden with the scent of something rotten. The living room was dimly lit, and the air felt thick with an unshakable tension. Clara and I exchanged worried glances but followed her inside. "Sit," the woman commanded, her voice firm as she motioned to the worn-out couch. "What do you want to know?" I took a deep breath, my mind racing. "We want to know about the disappearances. We found articles about you, about what happened in this neighborhood." The man's gaze darkened, and the woman's expression hardened. "You shouldn't poke your nose into things that don't concern you," she warned, her voice low and menacing. "We need to understand," Clara urged. "People are afraid. We hear things at night, whispers, scratching." "What are you doing?" The couple exchanged glances, and in that moment, I saw something shift in their expressions. It was as if a dam had broken, and the flood of their secrets was ready to pour forth. "We didn't disappear anyone," the man said, his voice gravelly. "But we know who did." My heart raced. "Who?" The woman leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's a darkness here, a presence that feeds on fear and despair. It watches, waits, and it takes." "What do you mean?" Clara asked, her voice shaking. "It started long ago," the woman continued. "People began disappearing one by one, drawn to the woods, lured by whispers. We tried to stop it, but it was too late. The darkness had awakened." "What darkness?" I pressed, feeling a sense of dread wash over me. "The ones who came before us," the man explained. "They were taken. But not all of them left willingly." I felt my stomach churn as the pieces began to fall into place. The tapping, the whispers, it was all connected to this dark presence. "What can we do?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "Leave this place," the woman urged, her eyes wild. "Before it takes you too. It's not just a house. It's a trap. It feeds on your fears, your insecurities. Once it gets a hold of you, there's no escape." I looked at Clara, and the fear in her eyes mirrored my own. We couldn't stay here any longer. But just as I turned to leave, the lights flickered, and a deep, resonant whisper filled the air, sending chills down my spine. "Stay. Stay. Join us." The couple's expressions turned from fear to something darker, something almost predatory. "You can't leave now," the woman said, her voice laced with an unnatural calm. "You belong here." In that instant, I knew we were in grave danger. I grabbed Clara's hand, and we bolted for the door. But as we reached it, it slammed shut, trapping us inside. The whispers grew louder, and I felt the walls close in around us, suffocating us with dread. Desperately, I slammed against the door, my heart racing. "We need to get out!" I shouted, but the couple stood behind us, their expressions twisted into sinister grins. Just as I thought all hope was lost, Clara pulled me back, and with all her strength, she pushed against the door. To my astonishment, it swung open, and we tumbled out into the night, gasping for breath. We ran, not stopping until we reached the safety of our own home. Slamming the door behind us, I locked it, panting heavily. The whispers faded into the distance, but I knew they wouldn't be gone for long. That night, as I lay awake, the tapping returned, louder and more frantic than ever. Clara clung to me, her body trembling with fear. I knew we had to leave Maplewood, to escape the darkness that threatened to consume us. But deep down, I also knew that it wasn't just the house that held the secrets. It was the town itself, a place haunted by its past. And as I listened to the relentless tapping at the window, I couldn't help but feel that the darkness was watching us, waiting for the moment we would let our guard down. The nightmare wasn't over yet.